In December of 1937, in a city of 600,000 people, something happened that the human mind still struggles to comprehend. Not because it was hidden, not because it happened in secret, in the dark, but because it happened in broad daylight, in the streets, in the courtyards of universities, along the banks of a river that ran red for days. It happened while foreign businessmen documented it in diaries, while American missionaries filmed it on 16mm reels, while foreign diplomats sent urgent dispatches to their governments warning that what was unfolding in this city was unlike anything they had ever witnessed, and almost nobody stopped it. The city was Nanking, the capital of the Republic of China, a city of Ming Dynasty walls and ancient temples, of universities and hospitals, of ordinary families who had lived there for generations and believed, right up until the moment Japanese soldiers poured through their gates, that the walls would protect them. They did not. What followed over the next 6 weeks would be called by historians one of the greatest atrocities of the 20th century, a century that included the Holocaust, the Gulag, the killing fields of Cambodia, and the Rwandan genocide. That is the company Nanking keeps. This is not a story about numbers, though the numbers are staggering. This is a story about how it happened, about the decisions made by generals and princes and ordinary soldiers that turned a military occupation into something historians have called an orgy of destruction, about the small group of foreigners who stood between 100,000 civilians and death, and about the long, unfinished reckoning that follows every crime the world fails to punish properly. My name is not important. What is important is this: the last surviving witnesses to what happened in Nanking are dying. The average age of those interviewed by the USC Showa Foundation in 2015 was 85 years old. Within a decade, the last living memory of this event will be gone. So we need to tell it now. We need to tell it completely, and we need to tell it honestly. Let us begin where all stories begin, at the beginning. Part 1. The Road to Nanking. To understand what happened inside that city, you first have to understand how Japan got there. Because the rape of Nanking did not begin in Nanking. It began years earlier in the military culture and imperial ambitions of a nation that had convinced itself that domination of Asia was not merely its right, but its destiny. Japan's march toward China had been building since 1931. That September, Japanese army officers staged a false flag explosion on a Japanese-owned railway in Manchuria, blamed it on Chinese saboteurs, and used it as a pretext to invade and occupy the entire province. The Mukden incident, as it was called, was a lie, engineered by junior officers who knew their government in Tokyo would go along with the conquest once it was accomplished. They were right. By 1932, Japan had turned Manchuria into a puppet state called Manchukuo, installing the last Qing emperor Puyi as a figurehead. The League of Nations condemned the move. Japan responded by withdrawing from the League. The message to the world was clear. Japan would take what it wanted, and the world could object all it liked. For 6 years, Japan and China circled each other in an uneasy, violent standoff. Then, on July 7, 1937, a skirmish between Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing sparked something that neither government could control. Within weeks, what began as a regional incident exploded into full-scale war. The Japanese military high command believed it would be over in 3 months. China would be crushed quickly. The nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek would collapse. Japan would consolidate its control over the largest country on Earth. That calculation depended on a rapid, decisive victory at Shanghai, the most modern and internationally connected city in China. It did not go according to plan. Chiang Kai-shek threw his best divisions into Shanghai. The battle that followed lasted 4 months and cost both sides catastrophically. Japanese planners had expected light resistance and a quick victory. Instead, they found themselves in bloody urban combat, fighting house to house through miles of buildings against Chinese soldiers who refused to break. By the time the Japanese forced the Chinese into a retreat with a flanking landing at Hangzhou Bay in November 1937, they had suffered more than 40,000 dead and wounded. Their finest divisions had been chewed up in 3 months of fighting that had humiliated the Imperial Army's reputation for swift, decisive warfare. The soldiers who survived the Battle of Shanghai were exhausted, undersupplied, and seething. One Japanese officer recorded in his diary that the men in his unit had watched their closest comrades die. They were furious. They were looking for an outlet. Their commanders pointed them west, toward the Chinese capital, 300 kilometers away up the Yangtze River, toward Nanking. General Iwane Matsui, the commander of the Japanese Central Area Army, had argued for this push even before leaving Japan. He believed the fall of the capital would break Chiang Kai-shek's will to fight and end the war in a single stroke. His superiors were skeptical, but allowed it. What nobody planned for was what would happen on the march. The 170 miles of road, railway, and river between Shanghai and Nanking became what one historian called a nightmarish zone of death and destruction. Japanese forces advancing along multiple axes were supposed to be living on supplied logistics trains that did not materialize. The supply system had broken down under the pressure of the Shanghai campaign. Commanders issued informal instructions to requisition what was needed from the local population. In military terms, that phrase, living on the land, has always been a green light for plunder. Japanese soldiers burned villages, looted food, and killed anyone who resisted. But there was something more than mere opportunistic brutality on that march. There was a policy. In continuation of practices that had begun in Shanghai, Japanese units were executing captured Chinese soldiers rather than taking them prisoner. The logistical argument was simple. They didn't have food for prisoners, and prisoners slowed the advance, so they killed them. In village after village between Shanghai and Nanking, survivors would later testify to what they had seen. The pattern was consistent. The men were taken out and shot or beheaded. The women were assaulted. The buildings were burned. Then the column moved on. One particularly horrifying incident was reported near the town of Nanxiantao. A hamlet was set alight. Many of its inhabitants were locked inside the burning buildings. 2 women, one of them pregnant, were assaulted, and then the soldiers cut open the pregnant woman. A 2-year-old boy was wrestled from his mother's arms and thrown into the flames. The remaining villagers were bayoneted and thrown into a nearby creek. This was not exceptional. It was the pattern. And all of this happened before a single Japanese soldier entered Nanking's gates. Inside the city, the population was terrified. News had been filtering in for weeks about what was happening to the towns and villages in the Japanese path. Chiang Kai-shek had made the fateful decision to move the Republic government to Chongqing and to withdraw most of his professional military forces from the capital, rather than allow them to be destroyed in a hopeless siege. Chiang was still giving that speech as Chiang was quietly boarding a plane to Chongqing. When the Chinese leaders fled, they left behind a city of over 500,000 civilians, an army that had no real hope of success, and a small group of foreigners who made a decision that even today is difficult to fully explain. They had decided to stay. Part 2. The Foreigners Who Stayed. Of all the extraordinary human stories embedded in the catastrophe of Nanking, none is stranger than this. When the Japanese came, the people who stood between the city's civilians and annihilation included a German Nazi, an American missionary woman, and a surgeon who couldn't bring himself to leave. Let us begin with the German.
John Heinrich Detlef Rabe was 55 years old in December of 1937. He had been living in China since 1908, almost 30 years, first in Beijing and then in Nanking, where he worked as the chief representative of the Siemens Company. He was, by every account, a decent, practical man who loved China genuinely, and who, back home in Germany, had joined the Nazi Party, as millions of ordinary Germans had, because it was useful for his career, and because he believed, as many did in the 1930s, that Hitler was restoring German pride without necessarily understanding what else he was restoring along with it.
Rabe was the chairman of the newly formed International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone, a group of 15 Americans, Germans, and other Westerners who had come up with an idea that was either brilliant or reckless, depending on how you looked at it. They would designate a portion of the western city, roughly the size of New York's Central Park, as a neutral zone. No Chinese military forces would be permitted inside. No Japanese military forces would be permitted to operate there. Civilians could shelter within it, protected by the committee's authority, their flags, and whatever diplomatic leverage their nationalities could provide. The Japanese government had tentatively agreed not to target the zone. The committee had persuaded the Chinese garrison to withdraw from its borders. On paper, it looked like a workable arrangement. In practice, Rabe's most important credential was the swastika on his armband. Germany and Japan were allies under the Anti-Comintern Pact. When Rabe drove his car through the streets of Nanking, and when Japanese soldiers approached, he would step out and point to his Nazi party badge and his flag. It worked. Japanese soldiers who would not have hesitated to bayonet a Chinese civilian paused when they saw the insignia of their allies' political party. They paused long enough for Rabe to intervene, long enough in dozens of cases for lives to be saved. He knew exactly what he was doing and what it meant. In his diary, he wrote that he wanted to witness the atrocities with his own eyes so that he could later speak of them as a witness. Such brutal crimes, he wrote, must not be kept silent. We know what Rabe saw because he wrote it down with the methodical precision of a German engineer keeping records of a factory disaster. His diaries run to 8 volumes. They were discovered and published only in 1996, nearly 6 decades after the events they describe. On December 14, 1937, the day after Nanking fell, Rabe drove through the city for the first time. He wrote that it was not until he toured the streets that he understood the scale of the destruction. Every 100 or 200 meters, they came across corpses. The bodies of civilians he examined had bullet holes in their backs. These people had been fleeing, he noted, and had been shot from behind. 2 days later, he recorded something else. In a house in a narrow street behind his garden wall, a woman had been assaulted and then wounded in the neck with a bayonet. He managed to get an ambulance, and then he wrote the sentence that has haunted historians ever since. He wrote that last night, up to 1,000 women and girls were said to have been assaulted, about 100 girls at Ginling Girls' College alone. You hear nothing but rape. If husbands or brothers intervene, they are shot. That last line, if husbands or brothers intervene, they are shot. Think about what that sentence describes. A man who tries to protect his wife or his daughter from assault is killed in front of her. The violence was not incidental, it was structured, it was designed to prevent resistance. Rabe wrote letter after letter to the Japanese embassy demanding they restore order. He sent detailed lists of incidents, addresses, names of victims where they could be obtained. The Japanese embassy occasionally sent small detachments of military police who would briefly show their faces and then disappear. The atrocities continued. Now let us talk about the woman at Ginling College. Minnie Vautrin was 51 years old in December 1937. She had come to China as a Christian missionary from Illinois and had spent the previous 2 decades
building Ginling Women's College into one of the most respected educational institutions in the country. She loved her students, she loved China, and when the Japanese came, she did not leave. She turned Ginling College into a sanctuary. Women began arriving at the gates in the days before the fall of the city. They came in 2s and 3s at first, and then in hundreds, and then in thousands, sleeping in dormitories, in hallways, on the lawns, wherever space could be found. By the height of the crisis, Ginling College sheltered more than 10,000 women and children within its walls. Vautrin stood at the gate. That is not a metaphor. She physically stood at the gate day after day, pushing back Japanese soldiers who came to take women from the camp. She had no authority beyond her American passport and the force of her personality, and the knowledge that Japanese soldiers who were killing Chinese by the tens of thousands were still pausing slightly before murdering American citizens outright because of the diplomatic complications it would cause. She used that pause. She used it every single day.
Her diary entries from this period are among the most important documents of the massacre. On December 15, 2 days after the fall, she wrote simply that the Japanese had looted widely, had destroyed schools, had killed citizens, and had assaulted women. Her Chinese colleague at Jinling, Chen Suifang, kept her own diary alongside Vautrin's. On December 17, writing at midnight, she recorded that she was sitting at her desk unable to sleep because that evening she had experienced, for the first time, what it meant to be a slave of a conquered country. The slavery life, she wrote, was very difficult to endure, and she added, with a rawness that is still difficult to read 80 years later, that if she were not struggling for the survival of the Chinese race, she would commit suicide. There was a third figure in the safety zone that deserves to be remembered. Dr. Robert Wilson was the only surgeon remaining in Nanking after the Japanese arrived. Every other Western doctor had evacuated. Wilson stayed because the hospitals were full and the patients could not leave, and someone had to operate. He worked around the clock at Drum Tower Hospital. Victims arrived with bayonet wounds, with burns over most of their bodies, with injuries from violence that he later testified he had never encountered in any other context. He performed surgeries without reliable electricity, without adequate anesthesia, without sufficient blood or supplies, because there was nothing else available and people were dying on the tables if he stopped. He was, by every account, a man of extraordinary competence and extraordinary psychological endurance. But even Wilson had his limits. In his letters home during this period, he described the situation in terms that suggested a man who was witnessing things his training had given him no framework to process. These three people, a German Nazi businessman, an American missionary woman, and an American surgeon who refused to leave, were the closest thing Nanking had to protection during the worst weeks of the massacre. The combined moral authority of a swastika armband, an American passport, and a surgical apron. It was, considering the circumstances, more effective than anyone had a right to expect. Part 3. 6 Weeks of Darkness. December 13, 1937. The 9th Division enters through the Guanghua Gate. The 16th Division enters through the Zhongshan Gate. 2 Japanese naval fleets arrive on both sides of the Yangtze River. The walls that had protected Nanking for centuries, mean nothing now. The general in overall command of the Chinese forces in the city, Tang Shengji, the man who had sworn to fight to the death, escapes by boat across the Yangtze River. He leaves his soldiers behind, without orders, without a command structure, without any indication of whether they should fight, surrender, or flee. What follows is chaos. Chinese soldiers strip off their uniforms and try to blend into the civilian population in the safety zone. Japanese units sweep through the zone looking for soldiers in disguise. The problem is that many of the men they identify as soldiers have never been soldiers. They are factory workers, shopkeepers,
university students, elderly men. The identification process consists, in many cases, of a quick look and a decision by a Japanese sergeant who is operating under enormous pressure and whose instinct is to err on the side of execution. The numbers of Chinese soldiers captured in and around Nanking were enormous. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 50,000 and 90,000 Chinese troops surrendered or were captured during the fall of the city. This created a problem that Japanese commanders solved in the most brutal way imaginable. They had no facilities to hold that many prisoners. They had no food to feed them. They had received a culture of instruction, formalized by the martial code of Bushido and informally reinforced throughout the Shanghai campaign, that prisoners were a burden and a potential security risk. Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, the emperor's uncle, had taken formal command of the Shanghai Expeditionary Force just 1 week before the fall of Nanking, on December 7th. He met with his division commanders and was briefed on the situation. He then issued an order: kill all captives. That order, signed with imperial authority, removed whatever restraints might otherwise have existed on what happened next. At Mufu Mountain, on the north bank of the Yangtze, Japanese forces marched somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Chinese prisoners down to the riverbank. They tied them together in groups of 5, they lined them up along the water, and they opened fire with machine guns. The Yangtze River, witnesses reported, ran red with blood for days. At Straw String Gorge, similar scenes played out. Mass executions by machine gun, by bayonet, by sword. Bodies burned with gasoline and thrown into the river to destroy evidence. In the city itself, smaller mass executions were happening simultaneously in every neighborhood. New York Times correspondent Tilman Durden had stayed in the city for several days before leaving for Shanghai to file his dispatches. Just before boarding the ship, he watched the execution of 200 men. The killings, he wrote, took just 10 minutes. The killing contests had begun even before the city fell. 2 Japanese sub-lieutenants, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, had been competing since leaving Shanghai to see who could be first to kill 100 Chinese with a sword. Their exploits were reported with enthusiasm by Japanese newspapers as a sporting achievement. By the time they reached Nanking, they had each exceeded 100, so they raised the goal to 150. Their commanding officers knew about the contest. The newspapers back home were celebrating it. That detail matters, not just as evidence of atrocity, but as evidence of what the Japanese military and Japanese society had normalized by December of 1937. The murders were not being hidden, they were being reported as news. Inside the safety zone, Reverend Emily Macklem, an American missionary who had stayed behind, wrote in his diary on December 19 that he did not know where to begin and did not know where to end. Never, he wrote, have I heard or read of such brutality. On January 14th, a month after the fall of the city, American Vice Consul James Espy arrived in Nanking to reopen the American embassy. He later described what he found. The picture, he wrote, was one of a reign of terror that had fallen on the city upon its occupation by Japanese military forces. The atrocities in Nanking proper peaked in the first 3 weeks of the occupation, but they did not stop in January. Violence persisted in the surrounding countryside and within the city's outskirts until late March 1938, when the Japanese established a collaborationist government under Chinese figureheads. By that point, the city had been transformed. Rabe, writing about his plans to leave, noted that the Nanking he was leaving was nothing like the city he had known. The life had gone out of it. The streets that had been busy and full of commerce were empty. The houses were looted shells. The few civilians who remained moved through the ruins of their former city like ghosts.
Part 4. The numbers that cannot be agreed upon. When people discuss Nanking today,
The argument always comes around to numbers. How many died? And the frustrating truth is that no one knows with precision, and no one ever will. Here is what the historical record says and why it is disputed. The official Chinese estimate, carved into the stone of the Memorial Hall in Nanjing today, is 300,000. This number has become a symbol of national memory for China, a totemic figure inscribed in school textbooks and government speeches. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Trial, put the number at over 200,000 in the city and its vicinity. Most independent Western historians, working from burial records, Japanese military reports, demographic surveys conducted in the months after the massacre, and eyewitness testimony, place the figure somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000. Lewis Smythe, the American sociologist who conducted a careful survey of Nanking's urban and rural areas between March and April 1938, recorded 12,000 civilians murdered inside the city walls and another 26,000 killed in the surrounding countryside. But Smythe's survey was incomplete. The chaos, the fires, and the mass graves in the Yangtze River made a precise count impossible. John Robb himself, who could only speak to what he had witnessed within the safety zone and its immediate surroundings, estimated 50,000 to 60,000 civilian deaths. The editor of his diaries noted this was almost certainly an undercount, since Robb had no view of the riverbank massacres or the killings in the outlying countryside. Japanese nationalist historians, a vocal and well-funded minority in Japan, claim the number was closer to 40,000. Some go further and argue the entire event was fabricated or grossly exaggerated for political purposes. This position is contradicted by Japanese military diaries from the period, by Japanese newspaper reports celebrating the killing contests, by the records of the Safety Zone Committee, by diplomatic dispatches from multiple countries, and by decades of archaeological evidence in the form of mass graves. The debate over numbers, it must be said, often functions as a mechanism of avoiding accountability rather than a genuine historical inquiry. If the true number was 100,000, that is not evidence that the event was less serious than claimed. It remains a catastrophe. The arguments about whether it was 200,000 or 100,000 have been used deliberately to create enough uncertainty to deny the event's moral weight rather than to clarify its history. What is not in dispute is this. Between early December 1937 and late March 1938, the Imperial Japanese Army conducted mass executions of prisoners and civilians on a scale that killed at minimum tens of thousands and very likely over 100,000 people. Between 20,000 and 80,000 women were assaulted. 1/3 of Nanking's buildings were looted and burned. A city of 600,000 was reduced to a shadow of itself. These facts are documented in Japanese military records, in foreign diplomatic dispatches, in contemporaneous journalism, in film footage, in thousands of photographs, and in the testimony of survivors. Part 5. The man who tried to warn the world and was silenced. John Rabe left Nanking in February 1938 and returned to Germany. He had been in China for 30 years. He loved the country. He had watched it be destroyed. He had documented everything. He believed that if the German government, Japan's ally, confronted Tokyo with the evidence, there was a chance that something would change. He gave speeches in Berlin. He showed film footage taken by the American missionary John McGee, who had documented the massacre on a 16mm camera. He compiled his reports into a dossier and sent it to Adolf Hitler. The Gestapo arrested him. He was released after the Siemens company intervened, but only on the condition that he sign a pledge of silence on the subject of Nanking. The Gestapo kept the McGee footage and his reports. He was forbidden to speak further. Rabe spent the rest of the war in Germany in relative obscurity, working again for Siemens. After the war, he was subjected to denazification proceedings because of his party membership. The man who had risked his life to protect 250,000 Chinese civilians from Japanese soldiers was being investigated as a potential war criminal because of his membership in the party that had silenced him for trying to prevent war crimes. He was eventually cleared, but by that point his health had collapsed. The post-war food shortages in Germany hit him badly. He was reduced to near starvation. When news of his condition reached Nanking, the survivors who had sheltered on his property, the people whose lives he had saved, organized a relief effort. They sent him food packages. They sent money. He died in January 1950. He was 67 years old. He died in poverty. His diaries, the 8 volumes that document the destruction of Nanking in such painstaking detail, were kept by his family in Germany, largely unknown to the outside world. They were discovered by historian Iris Chang during her research for her 1997 book, The Rape of Nanking, which brought the massacre to wide Western attention for the first time. When the diaries were published in 1996, the city of Nanjing made Rabe's tombstone a place of honor. Today, flowers and handwritten notes appear regularly at his grave in Berlin. One recent visitor left a message that read simply, "Thank you, Mr. Rabe, the good man of Nanking." He would have been pleased by that. Part 6. The Command Question. After the war ended in August 1945, the reckoning began, and it was, from the start, incomplete. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, what history calls the Tokyo War Crimes Trial, convened in April 1946. It indicted 28 Japanese military and political leaders as Class A war criminals. The Nanjing Massacre was a central element of the prosecution's case. General Iwan Matsui, the commander of the Central China Area Army, was convicted and executed on December 23, 1948. The tribunal's verdict was specific. It found that Matsui knew what was happening, that he had the power to stop it, and that he had done nothing effective to do so. He had, the tribunal ruled, failed in his duty of command. Historian Yuma Totani later noted that this verdict represented one of the earliest precedents for command responsibility in the history of international law. The idea that a general could be executed for atrocities committed by troops under his command, even if he had not personally ordered them, was, in 1948, a new principle being established in real time. Foreign Minister Koki Hirota was also convicted and executed. The tribunal found that he had been told about the atrocities, had raised them weekly with the military, and had allowed himself to be shut down without further protest. He was, the verdict concluded, derelict in his duty. But then we come to the man that matters most, and his name is not on any list of the executed. Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, the emperor's uncle, the man who had signed the order to kill all captives before the assault on Nanking began, was given immunity by General MacArthur. He was a member of the imperial family. MacArthur had decided, in consultation with the Truman administration, that prosecuting members of the imperial family would destabilize Japan and undermine the American occupation's reform program. Emperor Hirohito himself would not be charged, and if Hirohito was immune, the logic extended to his relatives. Asaka lived until 1981. He was 94 years old when he died. He was never charged with any crime. He was never required to testify before any tribunal. In interviews he gave late in life, he said he did not know what had happened in Nanking. He was the man who had signed the order. The contrast with the Nuremberg trials in Germany is uncomfortable and important. Germany's prosecution of Nazi war criminals, however imperfect, was undergirded by a willingness to establish accountability at the highest levels. In Japan, the structure of accountability was deliberately designed to stop before it reached the palace. MacArthur made a political calculation that preserving imperial continuity would serve American Cold War interests in Asia, and that calculation overrode justice. The consequences are still being felt. General Matsui, the man who was executed, has been enshrined as a martyr at the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, Japan, Japan's most revered memorial to its war dead. In 1978, the names of 14 convicted Class A war criminals, including Matsui, were secretly added to the shrine's rolls. When Japanese prime ministers and cabinet members visit Yasukuni to pay their respects, they're paying respects to convicted architects of the rape of Nanking. China protests this. China always protests this, and the protests accomplish nothing because Yasukuni and the political culture it represents are protected by a constituency in Japan for whom acknowledging the full weight of wartime atrocities is experienced as a national humiliation rather than a moral obligation. Part 7. The Great Denial. Here is something that is difficult to say in a documentary about historical atrocity without sounding partisan. So let me say it as plainly as I can and let the facts speak. Germany, after the Second World War, undertook a sustained national reckoning with its crimes. It was painful. It was incomplete. It took decades and remains ongoing. But the German government has apologized formally to the countries it attacked and the peoples it murdered. Holocaust denial is a criminal offense in Germany. The country's educational system treats the Nazi period as the central moral catastrophe of German history, and the acknowledgement of that catastrophe as a foundational civic obligation. Japan has not done this. This is not a simple statement. It is contested and complicated. There are Japanese historians who have written with great honesty and courage about what happened in Nanking and across China. There have been Japanese government apologies, some of them sincere and specific. Individual Japanese citizens have made profound efforts to bear witness to their country's wartime crimes. But in Japan, unlike Germany, denial is not merely permitted. In certain political contexts, it is celebrated. The pattern has repeated throughout the post-war decades. In the 1950s and 1960s, Japanese soldiers who had been stationed in Nanking began publishing memoirs acknowledging what they had seen. In the 1970s, a wave of nationalist revisionism pushed back against these accounts, claiming they were exaggerated or fabricated. In the 1980s, the Japanese government began intervening in school textbook descriptions of the Nanjing Massacre, softening language about the extent of Japanese atrocities in China. Chinese and South Korean protests were ignored. In 1990, a senior Japanese official publicly denied that the Nanjing Massacre had occurred. He was forced to resign. But his resignation did not come from the government's position. It came from diplomatic pressure. In 2014, a television station in Japan broadcast a documentary that challenged the standard historical account of Nanking, suggesting the death toll had been fabricated by Chinese communist propaganda. The documentary was criticized by historians, but generated significant viewership. In 2015, the Memorial Hall in Nanjing submitted the collection of documentary evidence about the Nanking Massacre, including John Rabe's diaries and the safety zone records, for inscription on UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. Japan lobbied against the inscription. Japan threatened to withhold its financial contributions to UNESCO if the inscription went forward. UNESCO registered the documents anyway. Japan temporarily withheld its payments. The revisionist position, stated plainly, is this: either the massacre did not happen, or the scale has been exaggerated for political purposes, or what happened was a legitimate military operation against guerrilla combatants who had shed their uniforms, or all of the above, depending on which audience the speaker is addressing. The evidence against each of these positions is overwhelming. The Japanese military's own diaries describe the killings. Japanese newspapers from December 1937 celebrated them. The Tokyo War Crimes Trial established them as historical fact based on testimony from hundreds of witnesses. The diplomatic records of a dozen countries corroborate them. The mass graves are still being discovered. But evidence has not been sufficient to close this debate, because the debate is not, at its core, about evidence. It is about identity, about whether Japan can acknowledge what its soldiers did in the name of empire without that acknowledgement being experienced as a negation of national pride. Germany answered this question one way. Japan has answered it another. The difference matters enormously to the survivors and their descendants, and it matters to the question of what history means, what accountability means, and whether the world is capable of learning from atrocity or merely of burying it. Part 8. The Woman Who Told the World and the Price She Paid. Before we reach the conclusion, there is one more story that needs to be told. Iris Chang was 29 years old when she began researching what would become The Rape of Nanking, published in 1997. She was the American-born daughter of Chinese immigrants whose own family had fled the advance of the Japanese army. The massacre was part of her family's living memory. She believed the West did not know about it, did not take it seriously, and that this ignorance was itself a form of injustice. She was right about the ignorance. When she began her research, the Nanjing Massacre was barely a footnote in most Western histories of the Second World War. The European and Pacific theaters dominated the narrative. What had happened in China, including the deaths of between 14 and 20 million Chinese civilians over the course of the entire sino-Japanese conflict, received a fraction of the attention given to the Nazi Holocaust, though the death tolls were comparable. Chang spent years tracking down survivors, diplomatic records, and the diaries of foreign witnesses. She found John Rabe's diaries in the hands of his family in Germany. She found Minnie Vautrin's diaries in a collection at Yale Divinity School. She assembled a body of evidence that was both comprehensive and devastating. The Rape of Nanking was published in 1997 and became an immediate bestseller. It spent 10 weeks on the New York Times list and sold over 500,000 copies. For the first time, a mass Western audience was confronted with detailed, documented evidence of what had happened in that city in December of 1937. The Japanese government was not pleased. Japanese nationalist organizations launched extensive campaigns to discredit Chang's scholarship, attacking specific details of her research and attempting to use minor factual errors to invalidate the entire work. Some of the criticism had merit. Historians have noted that some of Chang's numbers and certain specific accounts cannot be fully verified. But the core of her argument, that a mass atrocity of enormous scale had occurred and had been systematically ignored by the world, has been confirmed by every serious subsequent scholarship. Chang spent the rest of her life continuing to research Japanese wartime atrocities in China and the Pacific. She began writing about the Bataan Death March, about the use of biological weapons in China, about the system of forced sexual slavery that the Japanese military maintained throughout occupied Asia. The weight of this material, she later said in interviews, was becoming difficult to bear. She described symptoms that, reading her accounts today, suggest a profound psychological toll from years of immersion in documentation of mass human suffering. In November 2004, Iris Chang died by suicide. She was 36 years old. She left behind a husband, a young son, and the unfinished manuscript of a book about the Bataan Death March. The circumstances of her death became the subject of public discussion. Some of her family and colleagues believed the years of exposure to atrocity documentation had played a role. She had spoken in the months before her death of being overwhelmed by what she had read, of having seen things that she could not unsee. Whether or not that is the explanation, her loss felt disproportionate. She had done something genuinely important. She had forced a reckoning that nobody else was forcing, and she had paid a price for doing it that is still difficult to fully account for. The Rape of Nanking remains in print. It is still the primary text through which most Western readers encounter this history. John Rabe's diaries are available in English translation. Minnie Vautrin's diaries have been published alongside those of her colleague, Sen Shuifang. The documentary record is rich, detailed, and available. What remains is incomplete. The Reckoning.
Part 9. What happened to the survivors? The last survivors of Nanking are gone now, or nearly so. The average age of those who gave testimony to the USC Showa Foundation in 2015 was 85. The recordings of their voices, their hands folded in their laps, their pauses when the memory becomes too specific to describe simply, are now the primary living connection to what happened in that city. Liu Shiying was 78 years old when she appeared before a Tokyo court in 1996 to testify about her experiences. She described sheltering with about 100 young women in the cellars of a building when soldiers arrived. She said they knew what the soldiers were doing to women because they could hear it in the neighboring building. On the day she was taken, she was 19 years old and 7 months pregnant. Chu Ye Chang survived to tell a court what happened on New Year's Eve of 1937, when 5 Japanese soldiers entered his family's home. He and his father were forced outside, while his mother, his 80-year-old great-grandmother, and his 11-year-old sister were assaulted. These testimonies are important not because they add to the aggregate statistics, but because they insist on specificity. They insist that the abstraction of numbers be understood as individual human lives, individual human bodies, individual human families, destroyed with a specificity and an intention that the phrase mass atrocity can sometimes obscure. The city of Nanking today, the modern city, is a bustling metropolis of 8 million people. The walls of the Ming Dynasty, the walls that failed to protect the population in 1937, still stand. The memorial hall of the victims of the Nanjing Massacre by Japanese invaders, opened in 1985 and expanded since, receives millions of visitors per year, predominantly Chinese. The number 300,000 is carved into its exterior wall. Inside, among the exhibits, are the diaries, John Rabe's words, Minnie Vautrin's words, the records of the Safety Zone Committee, the photographs that Japanese soldiers themselves took of their own atrocities, photographs that somehow survived and found their way into archives and then into exhibition halls. Also inside, if you know where to look, are the bones. Actual bones, excavated from mass graves during construction projects in the city throughout the decades since the war. They are displayed in glass cases, femurs and skulls and ribs, still bearing, in some cases, the marks of the violence that ended the lives they belonged to.
Conclusion. What Nanking demands of us. Let me return to the beginning, to the question of why we need to tell this story now. The answer is partly practical. The witnesses are dying. The physical memory of the event is disappearing into records and exhibitions that will be visited only by those who choose to seek them out. Without active effort to keep this history in circulation, it will be marginalized, as it already was marginalized for the first 60 years after it happened. But the answer is also more fundamental than that.
Every major atrocity of the modern era poses the same challenge to our understanding of humanity. How does this happen? Not in the abstract, sociological sense, but in the specific, operational sense. How do individual human beings, men with names and families and ordinary lives, come to do what Japanese soldiers did in Nanking? The partial answers are available in the record. The dehumanization of the Chinese population in Japanese military culture, rooted in decades of nationalist ideology that positioned Chinese people as racially and culturally inferior. The specific brutal conditioning of Japanese military training, which used violence against recruits as a tool of discipline, and which created an institutional culture in which cruelty upward was punished and cruelty downward was normalized. The collapse of supply lines and command structure during the Shanghai campaign, which removed the practical constraints that might otherwise have limited atrocity, even in a dehumanized force. The specific order from Prince Asaka to kill all captives, which provided official sanction for what followed. None of these explanations is complete, none of them excuses, but understanding the mechanism matters, because the mechanism is not unique to Japan in 1937. Dehumanization of outgroups is not a Japanese invention. The collapse of command responsibility in the face of political pressure is not a Japanese phenomenon. The use of sanctioned violence to terrorize a civilian population into submission is a strategy that has been employed by armies throughout history. What Nanking teaches, if we are willing to learn it, is that atrocity is not an aberration. It is a possibility that exists wherever the conditions that enable it are allowed to develop. The conditions were allowed to develop in Nanking because the Japanese military had spent years building a culture in which Chinese lives were worthless, in which command authority flowed upward, but moral responsibility did not flow downward, and in which the international community's protests were understood to carry no real cost. John Rabe saw this clearly. Minnie Vautrin saw this clearly. Dr. Robert Wilson saw this clearly. They could not stop it, but they documented it. They testified to it. They refused to pretend it was not happening. That refusal is the model, not heroism in the Hollywood sense, not single-handed rescue or military intervention, just the insistence on accurate witness, the commitment to saying precisely and on the record what is actually happening, rather than what the powerful wish to be reported. After returning to Germany, Rabe sent his dossier to Hitler. He was arrested for it. He was silenced. He never gave up entirely on the idea that the truth, if documented precisely enough and repeated loudly enough, would eventually force a reckoning. He was right about one thing. The truth did survive. It survived in 8 volumes of diary that his family kept for 60 years. It survived in the film reels that John Magee shot on his 16mm camera. It survived in the dispatches of American diplomats and the letters of American missionaries and the testimony of Chinese survivors who carried the weight of memory through decades of a world that preferred not to be burdened by it. The truth survived. The reckoning is still incomplete. The 300,000 names on the wall in Nanjing are waiting for an honest accounting from the government whose soldiers put them there. The survivors who testified in the 1990s and the 2000s and whose videotaped testimonies now sit in archives are waiting for the world to remember what they said. Iris Chang, who gave years of her life and ultimately her life itself to forcing this story into the Western consciousness, is waiting for the history she documented to be treated as what it is, a crime of enormous scale, committed in documented detail, whose architects were never fully held to account. That waiting will not last forever. The generation that lived it is almost gone.
What we do with the record they left behind is a choice we are making now. Remember Nanking.